Saudi channel welcomes you. If you like the video, like, subscribe and comment, and we start the story. Napoleon. Who was Napoleon? If you'd like to learn more about one of history's most famous figures, who was Napoleon? That so many people say this about Napoleon is a sign of how successful he was. Napoleon was a French general and leader who helped to overthrow the King of France and establish the First French Republic. This later became the First French Empire, but more on that too. He's one of the most famous people in all of history, and his influence is still felt today. But despite all this, he's probably best known, at least outside of France, for being a little on the small side, which isn't the truth. As most historians will tell you, he was actually above average height for his time. His time as a general, he won lots of battles all across Europe, and people in Britain were worried that he might try to invade the country. So, they published lots of rumors like this in newspapers to try and make him seem a little less scary. In the end, it didn't matter too much. After losing the Battle of Waterloo, Napoleon was sent to exile on the remote island of St. Helena, where he died at the age of 51. A general to the end, his last words were France, the army, head of the army. The rise of Napoleon. In most paintings of Napoleon, he's wearing a big hat like this one. It's called a bicorn, just in case you're wondering. The rise and fall of Napoleon is about as dramatic a story as history has to offer. In fact, there's a whole library of books about the battles he fought, his rule, and his legacy. Of course, if you're looking to brush up on your knowledge of Napoleon, then here's the short version of his life story. Early life. Napoleon was born, in 1769, on the island of Corsica, which only became a part of France the year before his birth. When he was 9 years old, Napoleon moved to France proper, where he enrolled at a military school. It might come as a surprise that Napoleon didn't like France that much, at least not while he was at school. In fact, he couldn't even speak French when he first arrived there. Even after learning the language, he was bullied because he spoke it with such a strong accent. So, he spent a lot of time by himself, reading and studying. He was a great student. After finishing school, Napoleon moved to a military academy in Paris. He graduated in record time, and started his career in the French army. The French Revolution. When the French Revolution started, most people didn't have enough money to buy food. As you can imagine, they were pretty angry about this. In 1789, the French Revolution broke out. A lot of people were unhappy with the way that King Louis XVI was running the country, and they decided it was time for change. Despite not liking France that much, Napoleon was on board with the ideas behind the revolution. He wrote a paper in favor of a French republic, which was a hit with the revolutionary leaders. After reading Napoleon's work, they decided to put him in charge of an artillery unit. Napoleon did well in his first command, and he went on to become an important leader in the French army. He won some important battles in this time, which helped to overthrow the King of France and establish the Republic. In 1799, after an unsuccessful campaign in Egypt, Napoleon returned to France. Because of his earlier success, he was still very popular among the French people. The Republic was in a sorry state following years of war, and some wanted to put a strong leader back in charge. Seeing his chance, Napoleon organized a coup and became France's new ruler. Ruler of France. And, here's what Napoleon looks like without a hat. Napoleon set about writing a whole new constitution for France. It was made to give the impression that people were still able to choose their leader, but in reality, Napoleon was now more of a dictator. At this time, a lot of Europe was still at war, so naturally, Napoleon set out again to expand his empire. He won a few more famous victories, most notably in Italy, before making peace with Britain in 1802. This uneasy peace didn't last too long. In fact, just over a year later, Britain declared war on France again. This was the start of the Napoleonic Wars. Not happy with being the sort of elected leader of France, Napoleon became Emperor of the French in 1804, and he could now do pretty much whatever he pleased. So, he created his famous Grande Armée, which had up to 600,000 men at its strongest, and set out to conquer even more of Europe. Napoleon was, for the most part, successful with this. He won even more victories, including his most famous at Austerlitz, and controlled a large part of Europe at the height of his power. But, like a lot of leaders before and since, he got a little greedy. In 1812, Napoleon launched his ill-fated invasion of Russia. Even though he managed to take the capital city of Moscow, He was forced to return to Paris by a lack of food and the harsh weather, having lost most of his army. This was the beginning of the end for his rule. Exile. Even though it might sound a little silly, it's thinking like this that helped Napoleon conquer most of Europe. It also shows how much the man thought of himself. Seeing that he was weakened by his loss to Russia, other European countries made their move against Napoleon. This was the start of the War of the Sixth Coalition. But, surprisingly, they still couldn't beat him. Napoleon won even more victories until, eventually, he lost at the Battle of Leipzig in 1813. He rejected peace offers from the other European countries, believing that he could still win the war. And for a while, he continued to hold out, but it wasn't enough. Eventually, Napoleon lost, and the coalition invaded France. Perhaps not surprisingly, Napoleon wanted to keep going even after losing. His soldiers, on the other hand, were tired after years of fighting, and decided enough was enough. He was exiled in 1814. After 100 days in exile, Napoleon returned to France with a force of only 700 men, picking up more on his march to Paris. He declared himself emperor again, and, seeing that he wouldn't quit, the coalition declared war on France again. The rest is history. Napoleon lost the Battle of Waterloo in 1815, sealing his fate forever. He tried to flee France, but he realized that the British had blocked every port, so he surrendered. He was exiled to the remote island of St. Helena, in the South Atlantic. Not long after arriving in St. Helena, Napoleon's health worsened. He died a few years later, in 1821, and was buried on the island without any kind of grand ceremony. But, there's more. Like the legend he is, Napoleon's story doesn't end on St. Helena. About 20 years after his death, his body was moved back to the French capital, where it still rests. He's considered a hero to many French people even today. And, even though historians still disagree about the man himself, there's no doubt that he left a huge mark on French and European history. What was said about Muhammad by Napoleon? What is remarkable about Islam is its ability to conquer half the world in just 10 years, Napoleon said in one of his reflections on the religion and its prophet. It summoned people to believe in a single deity and destroyed counterfeit gods. The prophet of Islam was a magnificent man who founded a nation in the center of the Arabian Peninsula. He was a courageous warrior, an outstanding leader, a gifted orator, and a statesman. Regarding the pyramids, what did Napoleon say? Napoleon, from revolution to empire. From the heights of the pyramids, 40 centuries gaze upon us, General Bonaparte said to his troops upon his arrival in Egypt. Napoleon occupied Egypt for what reason? Egypt became the main topic of conversation between Napoleon and Charles Talleyrand. Given Egypt's advantageous location along trade routes, Napoleon suggested to the Directory in 1798 that an expedition be sent to take over Egypt in order to protect French interests and limit Britain's access to India, so threatening its trade. How was Napoleon able to get out of Egypt? He set out in the dead of night on the ships La Merbrun and La Carrère, with 400 to 500 people on board, according to one of Napoleon's close associates. They had to use the starlight to find a way to the ships because the night was so dark. Goodbye, buddies.